Hi, welcome to the Lit Festival. I am Anna James, and you might notice this is a slight change of plan. Apologies if you were expecting a slightly different combination of people. I'm the author of Pages and Co, but I'm also kind of stepping into hosting duties today because Mandy from Lit is dealing with some family health stuff, and we all send all our love to her. So we've had a bit of a last minute change, and we're gonna the three of us are gonna run the show ourselves, so bear with us. So I've written this down so I get it right what Mandy says. This is the Fantasy Fiction and Me panel, which is part of Lit's online weekend of talks and workshops. Lit is an annual weekend festival based in Macclesfield. So that's the official intro. So as the title kind of suggests, the three of us are going to talk about our books, our creative process and writing, and hopefully it will be a sort of interesting and hopefully inspiring event for you watching. I think there's probably a mix of readers and aspiring writers, so we're going to kind of cover both sides of it. And then there's also the opportunity to ask questions. If you're watching on YouTube, you just pop them into the chat, and probably we'll come to those at the end, unless something, we might work a few in, but don't worry, if I'm not coming to them, we will come to them at the end of the panel. Okay, so I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we're going to kick off with doing a short reading each to kind of give you a flavour of the three books before we get into a chat about how we write and writing fantasy and writing for children, all of that. So firstly, Francesca Gibbons, debut author of The Shadow Moth, which is the first book in the Clock of Stars trilogy. And then we have Dominique Valente, who's the author of the Starphil series. So the first one, Willowmoss and the Lost Day, was published last year. Sequel, Willowmoss and the Forgotten Tale, was this year. And then you've just announced book 3, which is Willowmoss and the Vanished Kingdom, which is next year. Yeah. And then I'm Anna, I'm the author of the Pages and Co series, which are Tilly and the Book Wanderers, Tilly and the Lost Fairy Tales, and Tilly and the Map of Stories, which just came out in September. So I'm going to start with Fran. So would you be able to just give us a sort of like kind of brief introduction to the kind of world of your books and give us a bit of a reading?
Yes, hello, thank you, Anna. That was a brilliant introduction. So my book is called A Clock of Stars, The Shadow Moth. It's about two sisters who follow a moth through a door in a tree and into another world where they get trapped. And then most of the story is following their adventures as they try to get home and how their relationship changes throughout their adventures. So I'll start with a short reading, which is the prologue. The monster stood alone on the side of the mountain. He held out his hands. Fly with courage and speed and the will of the stars. If you just do one thing, help return what is ours. He parted his claws so there was enough space for the moth to escape. It crawled over the back of his hand and circled his wrist. It had a silver grey, fluffy body. Fly with courage and speed and the will of the stars. Sorry. If you just do one thing, help return what is ours. The moth opened and closed its wings to show it was thinking. Then it travelled up the monster's arm. I'd forgotten how strange you creatures are, said the monster, scratching his bald head. All the other moths just flew away. The moth's tiny legs tickled the monster's collarbone. He closed his eyes and repeated the words for a third time. Fly with courage and speed and the will of the stars. If you just do one thing, help return what is ours. The monster opened his eyes. The moth was crawling across his face, past his teeth, which stuck out like tusks, over his squished-in nose and onto the top of his head. That's it, he said. You've reached the end of Zubi. There's no more of me. There was a faint flutter and he looked up. The moth was flying away, but it wasn't travelling across the forests like the moths he'd released before. It was heading up the face of the mountain. Zubi soon lost track of its shape in the darkness, even with his sensitive eyes. Where are you going? He called. You won't find it among the stars. And there's an illustration of Zubi and the Moth by Chris Riddell.
And I'm gonna we're gonna come back to illustrations, and I can actually see that one of the questions, one of the first questions is about illustrations. So we will come back to that. Great. Okay, so Dom, would you give us a little introduction to Starphil and a reading?
Yes, definitely. So Starphil, the first book, follows Willow Moss, who's a young witch who has the worst magical power in her family, the ability to find lost things like shoes or socks or her neighbor's missing wooden teeth. And no one thinks this is special, least of all herself, especially when you compare it to everyone else in her family who has very impressive skills. Her older sister can move things with her mind. Her other one can blow things up. So when the most powerful witch in all of Starphil comes to Willow's door with the news that last Tuesday has gone missing, Willow is very surprised to find that her humdrum ability that no one thinks anything much of is needed to save the world. And as Willow has never really left the cottage before, she's the, I should imagine it's almost like Franz with the overlooked little sister. So it might be good to read it after A Clock of Stars. She decides what she's going to take with her on this perilous adventure, and also decides to bring along her own best friend. So this is where the reading picks up from: The Monster from Under the Bed. She then stood thinking for a minute, her fingers drumming her chin, trying to make up her mind. Should she or shouldn't she? Then she knelt down, and after a bit of scrambling, she pulled out the monster who lived under the bed, clasping him firmly by his long tail. This was to his absolute horror, which sounded like this: "Oh no! Oh, me greedy aunt! A pox on you from all the kobolds!" And she put him alongside her worldly belongings. Oh, sorry about this. Monster was a bit of a stretch. Oswin was in fact a kobold, a species that only just fell into the classification of monster, but it was best not to tell him about this, as he was very proud of his heritage. Through groggy slits that exposed luminous orange eyes that hadn't seen daylight for several weeks, Oswin was glaring at her now. His lime green fur was turning a ripe pumpkin colour in his outrage, and his bright green and white tail electrified with indignation. "What you go and do that for? Grabbing people by the tail? Is that any way to treat a boy? No respect, and me being the last kobold and all," he muttered darkly. Then he scratched a shaggy ear with a long, slightly rusty claw and grumbled, "I have half a mind to leave, especially after I got you them awfully resistible feet thingamababies, which you never even thanked me for," he pointed out with a deep, hard-done-by sniff. Oswin was always a bit cross, so Willow ignored this. The thingamababies that he referred to were her next-door neighbour, Mrs. Cronebarrow's ancient, rather dead-looking bunny slippers. Willow had made the mistake of muttering one night that her toes were cold, so Oswin had gone next door and prized the prehistoric slippers from the old woman's sticky, corn-crusted feet with a butter knife. Willow had woken up to the feeling of something warm, wet, and icky attached to her feet, followed very closely by the sound of her own screaming. When she realized what it was, she still shuddered at the memory. Despite this, there was the faint, very faint chance that Oswin might come in handy on an adventure, thought Willow. He was really good at spotting magical ability as well as detecting lies, and his thick kobold blood allowed him to resist most forms of magic. He was also her only friend, and who would remember to feed him when she was gone?
And now I'm going to, I don't know, this is the awkward bit where I'm going to invite myself to. So Pages & Co. Is about book wandering, essentially. My heroine Tilly and her best friend Oscar realise that they are book wanderers, which means that they can travel inside of their favourite books, and sometimes characters come outside as well. And the series follows. Do you know what? It's hard. I don't know. You're about to get to the third book. I find it really hard when the third book's just come out, because it's basically impossible to talk about it without giving away spoilers. But basically, shenanigans and family secrets ensue, and they travel into all sorts of books, real life books. So things like Anne of Green Gables and Treasure Island, even some Shakespeare in the third book. In search of their inevitably they end up they're trying to rescue book wandering. But to avoid spoilers, I'm going to read a bit from the very first book, and this is actually the first time that Tilly ever book wanders into Alice in Wonderland. Ah, I've been waiting for you, Alice said, standing up. Would you like to come to a tea party? Tilly stopped short. Alice? Yes, Alice said impatiently. It's very rude to forget someone so quickly after you first met them, you know. No, Tilly protested. I haven't forgotten you. I started to wonder if you were really, well, real. Why, it's even ruder to question if someone is real. Alice leaned across and pinched Tilly lightly on the arm. Ow, yelled Tilly. What did you do that for? To prove I'm real, obviously, Alice retorted. But it's impossible, Tilly said in frustration. I used to be very similar to you, Alice said, patting Tilly on the arm where she had just pinched her. But so many out-of-the-way things happened to me that I began to think that very few things are indeed really impossible. I know a woman who spoke a lot of nonsense most of the time, it has to be said. But she once told me that she sometimes believed as many as 6 impossible things a day, and all before breakfast. So nowadays, I try to make a little more space for the impossible to happen. Alice attempted to give Tilly a moment to take in everything she'd said, but couldn't contain herself. Anyway, do you want to come to a tea party or not? You said yourself you want to be more curious. Tilly looked up and steeled herself. Why not? How much stranger could things get? Alice bounced excitedly next to her and held out her hand. Tilly shrugged and took hold of it. All at once, Pages & Co. seemed to divide into a grid of tiny tiles that click-clacked over each other like a wooden toy folding down on itself. In only a few seconds, the whole shop had dominoed down and seemed to wind itself in under Tilly and Alice as if pulled to them by a very powerful magnet. Tilly's stomach dropped like the moment you go over the top of a roller coaster, and there was a smell of marshmallows toasting on a bonfire. Instead of the familiar bookshop, Tilly and Alice were standing in a colourful forest, with a thatched house tucked into the trees and a long table set out in front of it. At one end of the table sat a large hare in a bow tie, a dormouse who seemed to be asleep, and a man wearing a rather mad-looking hat. Oh, you were talking about this tea party, Tilly said queasily. Alice nodded merrily. Welcome to Wonderland. It's always tea time here. Let me introduce you, she said, skipping over to the table. And please don't mind them if they are a little rude until they get to know you, and quite likely for a while after that as well. Right. It's funny. I've chaired events where I'm being an author at the same time, and it's always like I was sort of like it always seems very indulgent talking about your own books, even though that's what you're supposed to be doing. Right, so let's get out of that awkwardness of me having to do that, and let's chat about our books now. I know that Mandy was really keen for us to sort of talk about ideas and imagination and all of that sort of stuff. So I thought that a good place to start would just be kind of talking about where the seeds of the ideas for our series came from. Can you pinpoint like a specific moment or character that kind of really like kicked everything off? Start with Fran.
Yeah, I can pinpoint a few things. So the door in the tree is discovered by the two sisters in an old overgrown garden, and I know when I first got the idea, I was about 12, and it was an old garden that my parents used to take me and my sisters to. And it was, I think the family that used to own it were going bankrupt. So brilliantly, they were doing nothing to maintain it. And it was really wild, and it was a fun place to explore and run around. And I just thought as a child, like, oh, what would happen if you found a door in a tree, and where might it lead to? And what if your annoying little sister followed you through that door? So I did write a version of that book when I was 12, and then forgot about it until I was in my early 20s, and I was working in marketing, and I don't remember exactly when the idea came back to me, but at some point it must have done, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to try and write that story again. And I knew I wanted to have sisters at the heart of the story, and I'd also done a bit of traveling by that point and met my husband, who's Czech, so spent quite a lot of time throughout my 20s in the Czech Republic, and a lot of the book was written there. So some elements of the magical world are inspired by the Czech Republic. I think other elements are also just inspired by things that are around me in the UK as well, so it's a bit of a mishmash.
I always find that simple. You get asked, don't you, quite a lot about where your ideas come from, and like it is hard I didn't have like one eureka moment where it's sort of like a combination of things that kind of pull in, and there must, like, you know, it's like in hindsight there must have been a moment where I decided to write it, but it doesn't feel like that. And I think I sometimes feel like I need to come up with like a very like a story, like an origin story, but like I don't know if that's how it, I don't know, but for me that's never how ideas have kind of come to be. They've always kind of, you know, you just put stuff in your head, don't you? And at some point there's enough stuff that works together that kind of something starts growing from it. But I don't know if that's, I don't know, do you like have that, Dominique? Like, does it, or do you have like light bulb moments?
I do. I mean, not majorly, but I think with Starphil, a lot of it was. But I mean, I also write for, I write under a pen name. I write fiction for grown-ups. And it doesn't really happen in the same way. And for some reason, Starphil has had its own rules for me. And I think it's just because, I mean, I'm just a little bit bonkers by heart. And so I'll be thinking about strange things and then things will come to me. But so the world of Starphil had existed in my brain and sort of on paper since I was about 19. I'm 37 now, so it's a long time. And I tried to set quite a few different stories in this world, but it hadn't really worked. And then I sort of put it on a back burner. And the one day I was driving home from work and I was thinking about how in a lot of fantasy fiction, they have the chosen one. And I was just ruminating on this idea, and it can be a beautiful idea, but for sometimes it can be unrelatable, especially to me. You know, it's like the long lost princess or the person who has magic after 1,000 years. And it just feels like the equivalent of being a supermodel. And as I was driving, and that's when this little girl popped in my brain saying, you know, I have the worst magical power in my family, you know, and it was just like, oh, who's that, you know? And suddenly, and also Starphil was a lot older. It was like sort of YA, and after that, the whole world changed. And as soon as Willow Moss appeared, I almost rewrote the whole story because I was seeing it through a much younger child's lens. Which was quite tricky because a lot of the stuff that happens in the world is very, very dark. But so it's just that juxtaposition. But the next day I wrote the first chapter. But I mean, that's the first time it's ever happened to me. I mean, so honestly, I've written now under my other pen name, Lily Graham, I've written like 9 books, you know, and it's never been like that. You know, I've never had that little moment. But now things happen. You'll be in the shower and like that's when I came up with the word Starphil. I was in the shower.
It's funny that you say about the older audience, because when I first, I hadn't written really anything, but when I first sort of started thinking about like a magical bookshop, I thought of it as YA. And I think it was partly just because at the time, a lot of my friends were YA writers. And it was when like YA was going through like a real kind of boom, and I guess I just didn't stop to think about it. And also it's because one of the things that was feeding into my brain was, I don't know if you've seen the film Empire Records.
Oh yeah, love that.
It's such a good film. It's from the early 90s, and it's got like a young Liv Tyler in, a very young Renee Zellweger in. It's like but it's a proper kind of like American teen film, but it's about a group of teenagers who work at an independent record store. And I loved that film as a teenager, and I sort of was like, oh, it would be cool to have like one in a bookshop. But then like as soon as you get like a British bookshop, I don't think you can quite have that like group. They're so cool in the film. And so I sort of had that idea, and I wrote like, honestly, like maybe 2 pages, and it just wasn't good. Like it didn't work. And so even though I like kind of like the concept, like, you know, like a group of teenagers working in a bookshop, like it didn't work. And it probably is just that in hindsight, I don't know why I try, like YA I don't think is a good fit with me as a writer. And then I suppose the nearest to a eureka moment I had was like, I was like, well, what happens if Tilly, because she was I'm not sure she was called Tilly, but there was like a girl at the middle of it, and I just suddenly like, what if she was younger? What if she was a 10 or 11? And then that's when it started like falling into place, and I started writing, and the book still changed quite a lot, but like that's when I think I started writing and it started working, was when I thought of my main character as a child, not a teenager. So it's interesting the kind of age like you're writing for. What was your experience, Fran? Like, did you always see it as a middle grade children's book?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear you say that, and I think it feels like maybe you were quite immersed in that bookish world as well, so you had a greater awareness. Like the fact that you even knew that YA was booming is like, oh, that's news to me, because I didn't. I don't think I even really knew what the phrase middle grade meant until I got a publishing deal, and Nick, my editor, said, "Oh yes, and this is middle grade." I was like, "Oh, okay." But I think I don't know. It's really hard to say why you're obsessed with a certain age. I always think about. I always remember when I was quite young, my mum saying about how it's terrible getting older because you still think that you're this young person, and you look in the mirror and you're like, who's that old woman? Which is a horrifying thought. But I think a lot of people have this age in their head that is like their perfect age and the age they're at. And a lot of people I know are like, oh, 16 or 18 or 21. And for me, it's like 12. I just stopped maturing.
The same. And my gran actually said the same thing to me, and it was like quite a pivotal moment as well. She's like, she looks in the mirror and she goes, who's that old person that everyone's taking so seriously? And I was like, wow, so it never goes away. You always I'm always waiting for this moment to mature, and I think I've actually gone the other way around.
That's interesting, because I think related to this, like, is for me, I think it's not even so much the age I was sort of like the most kind of content, happy, like that age, as much as I think that the books that I read that had the greatest impact on me were the ones that I found when I was about 10, 11. And I think for me, that's part of the reason pages like worked when I started writing for that age, because even though when I was a teenager, there was books that we would think of now as YA, but they weren't called YA, and there wasn't a lot of British stuff. There was like, I read a lot of like Sweet Valley High, which is YA really, but it's not, it's such a brilliant space now that has so much in it and so many different kinds of stories. And I don't think I have like that deep down emotional relationship to that books for that age group like I do.
Yeah.
I discovered, like, so my all-time favorite author is Diana Wynne Jones, and I discovered her when I was about like 9 or 10, I think. And I think that, you know, and that's that I was probably 12 when I first read Northern Lights, which was a really influential book for me. And I think that that's the reason I'm drawn to that age group, is because those are the books that really, like, I think formed me as a person and as a reader and as a writer, honestly. And I think that you're drawn to both, times what you felt like as a person, but I do think also the books that meant the most to you kind of end up drawn to writing in that space as well. Well, I don't know, that's how I feel.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's probably one of the reasons that Starphil ended up working, is because I don't know if it was really YA, it was probably upper middle grade if I'm thinking about it now. But yeah, the stories that always meant the most to me were always those childhood stories. And I was had an obsession with my local library and reading classics, and so my favorite stories were always like very old. So I think that's why I love Pages and Co so much. But like Anne of Green Gables is like, I feel like she's like my spirit animal. I love her so much.
One of the greatest characters Anne like ever written, Anne Shirley. She holds so much to like a modern reading as well.
She really, really does, you know. And just some of the magic in some of these worlds, like, I don't know if you guys have read Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce.
I didn't like Tom's Midnight Garden.
I loved it so much. I love magical gardens and that kind of
I like it so much. I actually tried to reread it like earlier this year, and I couldn't get through it. Like, it just didn't. I want to like it more. I love the concept of it, but just doesn't gel.
Oh really? No, I love it. It's so old-fashioned, but I love it. And you know, I really did really badly at maths, which probably explains a lot, because the only thing I ever spoke to with my maths teacher at this age group was she recommended that book. And at least she had a good influence on something with me. Poor lady. But yeah, I love those stories, and they still every now and then you know, I think even with lockdown, I'm sure a lot of people can relate. You know, you start looking back towards those classics, and I mean, I've been rereading Jane Austen, you know, and just having so much fun. And it's like, I just adore her. And I haven't read Jane Austen in years. You know, I had a phase, I'm sure a lot of us do, like in your teens, you know, when you're going to read proper literature. I mean, I've got a degree in literature, but now I tend to read just whatever I feel like. But yeah, I did just read all the Jane Austens, and they're so great, you know.
I've been reading a lot of Diana Wynne Jones over this year. It's my comfort, like her children's fiction.
I feel like I've missed the boat on her because I don't know what happened. There's a few authors that because I write about witches, everyone assumes that I know a lot about them, and like, you know, it's not South Africa's fault. I don't know what it was, but I just wasn't exposed to, like, say, terrible things. I feel like I'm going to get invasive with it, but I didn't know about the worst witch, and which is quite funny because I've written a story about a girl with the worst magical powers, and I didn't really know about Diana Wynne Jones, and people were saying, "Oh, it's very much like Howl's Moving Castle," and I was like, "Really?" And so I had to read it later and go, "Wow, I feel like she could be like a kindred spirit. I really love her," you know. And everyone was like, "Oh, shades of," you know, and like, this is amazing, and you knew it's an amazing compliment, but I really felt like I couldn't give it the respect. Be like, yeah, thanks.
It is, honestly, I would see if someone ever said that they felt like pages had shades of Diana Wynne Jones, I would just die of happiness. I just think
now I know, and I'm like, no, she's way way better. But yeah, I mean, I've had to do a lot of so a bit like you, Fran, with the middle grade. It was like, Jill Murphy. She's wonderful. We just didn't get her.
It's all right. You're still allowed to read it now. That's the great thing, is that everyone makes these recommendations. It's like, oh, I can still read these books.
It's so true. And I mean, Mildred Hubble, I mean, how wonderful. So yeah, she holds up as an adult, even so.
What were the books that sort of meant a lot to you, Fran, when you were kind of the middle grade age?
Yeah, I think what you said really has struck a chord. I think you're right. It is at least partially those books, because I'm not obsessed. I love reading. Of course, I love reading, but I don't obsess over adult books in the same way. And Peter Pan is probably the one I keep coming back to, which again is very old-fashioned, very dated in quite a lot of ways now. But I've read that book so many times, and when I was a child, I was obsessed with the idea of flying and waiting for that actually quite sinister knock on the window that somebody's going to come and whisk you away in the middle of the night. But I think I like the Narnia books as well. I think those portal fantasies where you could be in your normal world one moment and you just open an everyday object like a window or a door and you're somewhere else. So there's something about that really still appeals to me now. And I know that as a child, I was looking for those portals.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. And I think that, like, with pages, that was massively what I was trying to like riff on, the idea that like each book you read feels like a portal when you're well, not, I mean, I do sometimes obsess about adult books, as I was gonna say. I don't think I've stopped. I sometimes get all about books that I'm reading, but like it is that transportation. Like I think that you feel it in a very visceral way when you're younger, and it's such a fun space to write in. And I do want to ask, like, because I'm aware, you know, we talked about, like, Dominique, you're talking about having all these like mad ideas in the shower, and like writing in like our books are all either like entire Starphil's, like it's an entirely like fantasy world, and then it's interesting. So they're all sort of slightly different facets, because Clock of Stars is like our world going into a completely fantasy world, and then obviously Pages is sort of like somewhere in the middle. It's our world, but there's magic in it. So when you're kind of thinking about, I'm like avoiding using the word world building because I feel like it's like a kind of buzz, like what does that mean? Like, ugh. But like I don't ever, when I'm writing, I don't ever sit down and think I'm going to do world building today. But that is what I'm talking about. And so I guess when you're thinking about your kind of the fantasy element, I guess, well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Like, do you sit down and think about world building? Like, how do you kind of create that other world and the kind of magic system? Like, again, is it just because I tend to find like I had the concept of book wandering, and then honestly, I like work it out as I go along, and I'm more drawn by like the characters, and then I have to do a lot of like, I want to do this in the story, and I have to kind of almost reverse engineer the like magic rules. And
that's really reassuring, because yours feels like there's very much a system behind it.
I shouldn't admit to this, should I? Like, I'm like, it's all very well planned out and I know exactly what's going on. Like, I do know some of it, but I absolutely get into situations all the time where I want to do something because it works for the plot and the characters, and I have to like, reverse engineer it with what
Yours is quite different, I think, to some fantasies, in that there is a system, I suppose, a bit like with Northern Lights, and to an extent Harry Potter, there's these rules going through it. And I don't have the language yet to express this, but I think I'm always in awe of those books that have a system, a magic system. And I think maybe Starphil is probably similar, though I'm only at the beginning. So that's what makes it feel like world building. And I have yet to put down too many rules in my world. And I always
don't do it. Save yourself now.
I really enjoy reading those kind of books, but I think I always come at it from a naturalist point of view, and I enjoy making the creatures. I enjoy making the magical animals and monsters, and that's probably where the magic is for me, is the landscape and the animals. And that sounds a bit naff, like nature is the magic, but
I'm the same. I'm exactly the same, so yeah, it was very much like the creatures and the characters come first, and I mean the first Starphil was pretty much, I mean, no wonder it didn't get a deal, like an agent for like 100 years, but it was pretty much 2 books in one. I mean, if you read both, I mean, that's insane, because I've packed so much into one book as it is. So I needed a lot of work on like scaling back and like every single time I get a note from my amazing editors, it's like simplify. Mm-hmm. I want to throw everything but the kitchen sink, and I know a lot of people do, but I genuinely throw everything at it. And I just go a little bit too bonkers, and then it's hard to to pare it back and then put on your logical brain. And so for instance, in my 3rd book, hopefully it's not a bit of a spoiler, but I have like creatures who bend the light, and and they use like the moon to do this, and but then you've got to research how moons work, and then but Starphil has 2 moons, and so there's all kinds of like things you've got to know while you're planning it, and that logic, and I love that. I love the idea of having something slightly bonkers, but then working out a logical way of making it work. So even if it's crazy, just trying to figure out how it, because I like explanations, so even if like say in the 3rd book, it's a place, there are portal walks instead of like portal points, and it's because of the flow of traffic was getting too much, so so they made whole streets into walks. And I like building things like that. I mean, it's just silly details, but I just feel like it gives it a sense of, I mean, I might be just fooling myself, but a sense of reality in a bonkers world.
I love that. It is funny the things you end up having to research. Like I have in the 3rd book, and then I'm writing the 4th book at the moment, there's a magical train that travels through imagination. And I'm like, I don't need to know anything about trains, because it's the train that travels through imagination. Like it's fundamentally impossible magic. So, and then I was just like, but that doesn't, it's that works to a point. But like I was writing a scene where they needed to stop the train, and I was like, how do trains? I was like, I know it's a brake, but I was like, is it, what physically does someone do? Is it like a button? Is it a lever? Is it like a pedal? I was like, it doesn't matter, except that it's if you're reading it and you do know about trains, it'd be annoying if someone was like, I press the button and then like, what? And it's just, and I suddenly found myself on Wikipedia, like,
Yes.
steam trains break. And I'm just like, how have I ended up doing this? Is my job, like just on Wikipedia getting really stressed out, because it turns out there's a million different brake systems for steam trains and I don't understand any of them. So I must have just got like
3 days have gone by. You can now write your doctoral thesis on steam engines or a paragraph that happens.
No. Is what's your, like, do you find, where do you sort of fall on that in terms of like, Fran, when do you like chuck everything at first draft and then rein it in, or do you like, which direction do you tend? Because I'm the same as Dom. I think my first drafts often are like barely holding together in terms of like logic, and it's just got a load of ideas in it, and then I have to sort of work it out and rein it in.
Oh, I try to avoid having to deal with logic too much, I think. The one that seems to come back and get me again and again is geography, which luckily I quite like. But because a lot of my books are based around quests and adventures that involve travel, I end up having to, I think my search history on Google makes me look like a serial killer, different ways to put children in danger. And how long do you have to strangle a child for? Like, oh God, don't ask that. But I end up Googling things like how far can children walk for before they get tired? Because I don't have children myself. I don't know what is a normal limitation for a 10-year-old anymore. So like how far can children walk? How do children get onto horses? There's quite a lot of horse riding in my second book. And I end up making, I think we've talked about this before a bit, Anna, I end up making maps of the worlds I'm creating so that I can make sure the distances are at least vaguely realistic. And I don't know why, but that is the level of realism that really bothers me, is the geography element of it in a way that other things don't.
It's funny though, isn't it? I remember when I gave Nick, so we're all with published by HarperCollins, and Fran and I have the same editor and the same agent. But when I gave Nick the first draft of book 3, he was just like, why do they keep having naps? And he was like, you build up all the tension and then you just destroy it because they stop and have a nap. And I'm like, because I don't know, it's not even to do with them being children. I'm like, because they've been traveling for ages and they haven't eaten. And like, I'm like, if I was in that situation, I would just want to have like a snack and a nap before I carried on. And he's like, that's very well, but like, this is a book, you can't like, they do just like, I have too many snacks and naps because that's what I would do. But it is you have to think about these things.
You do need a balance. Like in the first Starphil, I mean, she goes through so many different adventures and meets so many people, and like the whole way through she's never had one moment of peace, you know. And you get to a point where like, yeah, you need to slow down. You know, it's okay to have a sleep. So I try and build that in a bit. But yeah, if you had to look at it, like who could do all of that in one day or 2 days?
I'm related to this. I find that people sometimes are critical of children's books because they say like, oh, like the parents are dead or gone. And it's like, it's such a trope. And I'm like, but sometimes tropes are like, there's a reason that's a trope. And it's because children, and you can't, there has to be a reason. There's not somebody saying you can't do that, that's really dangerous and not your responsibility. And like I constantly get into situations where I'm like, oh, but like there's a parent figure there and they would just say like, no, you can't do that, and working out ways. And that's why there's loads of absent parents in children's fiction. You have to make it feasible that children are going to go on adventures. And you know, talk about the travel thing again, I'm being too honest. This is like, I should never, we need a chair because I like, this is too much of just an a huge reason I have a magical train is because I got into so much trouble with myself and my plotting in the first 2 books of having to physically get people places. And I'm like, you know what I'm writing in the next book? I'm writing a magical form of transportation. And now I just have a magical train and they get anywhere they want. And it just completely solves that problem. It doesn't, well, it's introduced, as we've mentioned, a whole host of other train related problems. But it has solved the fact that I don't have to constantly work out how to get 11-year-olds from one physical place to the other. I'm like, it's a magical train. So
and I think those restrictions, the restrictions of reality can be really helpful sometimes. I've definitely had points where I've assumed one thing would happen, and then because they have to travel or the characters are spread apart, you have to find new ways of making the story work. And I have found in some instances that it's been helpful. Like Dominique says, I think it's a bit of a balance.
Yeah, I mean, I've got in my so I totally understand what you mean. Like, I've got one of my characters is a dragon named Feathering, and a lot of the time he ends up just being like, even my agent is like, stop making Feathering the dragon taxi. He appears just when you've got too many characters, and like he's the big dragon bus.
So much of writing is sort of like, it's so much of it is logistics, isn't it?
Yeah.
Spend much more time thinking about logistics and travel and geography than I think you imagine before you kind of get published, and you really have to constantly, like, you have to write all the words. It sounds so ridiculous, but like when I'm thinking of a book, I'm like, I've got this scene and then I've got that scene, and then when I'm writing it, I'm like, that scene's done and I know what's going to happen in, like, you know, even just 200 words time, but they still have to, like, only you have to still write those 200 words that gets the next bit. And like, I find that's like, you know, the hard bit is,
I think maybe that is a fantasy. I don't know, because I've never tried to write anything else, but I think that might be a fantasy specific problem, because you've created this world, you've done your world building, if you want to call it that, and then the whole fun is to explore it. So you've got to have some way of getting around, like travel books.
True, and it makes it fun. And like for Starphil, for the second book, it's because a lot of the first book happened on brooms, and although I love Willow's broom, and it's there's a whole department, and like you really get into how brooms are made and they're magical creatures, but you also want to try something new. And so, and I love things that are slightly bonkers. So it's a boat that is sort of slightly alive. It's been made out of bathtubs, and it's got feet, and it's been charmed. And then I got to explore the sort of waterway around Starphil, which is not something I had really thought about before. And it's also like what you were saying, Fran, like what's going on in your own life will influence that kind of thing. And I live in Suffolk, which is along the coastline. And so I'll be looking at, you know, like you say, like actual boats. Like I've done a canal boating trip just to get the logistics and how things work and what birds. I mean, even though I make up most of the birds, give them different names and wings and that kind of thing. But it is nice to, I don't know, like you say, find new ways of making the logistics work.
I obviously I'm not going to say who this is, but I'm an author on Twitter who doesn't write fantasy. This was a couple of years ago, but I remembered it. I'm going to be very unspecific, but mentioned that they would never write fantasy because it's essentially too easy. Like magic is a get out of jail free card. And while sometimes it gives you things that you can do that you wouldn't obviously be able to do in contemporary, it also breeds, like we've been talking about, all of these complications and magic rules and systems and logistics that you don't have if you're in the real world. So I think, I don't think one is hard. They have different challenges, but they're definitely not like hard.
I honestly say hand on heart, because I have done both, that writing for children is way harder. And these people who come and say that, oh, you know, are you going to, you know, that they'll say to other children's authors that are you now going to write a real book or that kind of thing. If you only knew how hard it is to write this kind of thing. I mean, like my books are quite short, but the amount of work that goes into one is sometimes twice as much as what we're going to. And I don't mean I don't put a lot of work and effort into my you know, grown-up fiction, but it's just like you say, it's very straightforward. You know, a fact is a fact. If it happened in 1942, it doesn't change, you know what I mean? But if you change one thing in the fantasy world, it can mean rewriting an entire plot thread, or it will have potential, you know, if an editor comes back and says, oh, well, I really think this creature doesn't make a lot of sense doing this, it can actually impact the entire magical world and the systems, and you've got to figure out why. And I think that's why in a lot of fantasy books, suddenly areas start to vanish and reappear, and they don't appear on maps because you have to have a whole way of doing things in a different way, and then you've got to work out why, and the logistics of it is pretty tough. So I would say it's actually quite tough to write for, especially fantasy. I think it's pretty tough.
I'm aware that it is 1:45 and we've got lots of questions on coming in. So if it's okay with you guys, I'm going to start asking some of the audience questions. So Jalen, who is 9, has asked who is, and actually someone else asked this later, Ali asked this as well, about who are our favourite characters in our own stories to write. So Fran, do you have a...
I enjoy writing so many of them. That's a really difficult question. I do really enjoy writing my baddie, Aneshka. I think especially when I'm in a stinking mood, I often skip ahead and write the Aneshka chapters and think, yes, I'm going to kill some people now. And that cheers me up immensely. But I also really enjoy writing Miro the Prince, who's sort of like the opposite of a princess stuck up in a tower, because he's the little prince who's stuck up in a tower. And there's something quite vulnerable about him, and I don't know why that should make me enjoy writing him, but I do. And I think because he changes a lot, especially throughout the course of book 1, he starts off with some quite horrible views that he's learned from people around him, and he doesn't really know how to be friends with people because he's been alone or just in grown-up company for so long. So I think because he goes on such a big journey, it's enjoyable to write him and see him change.
Dom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. Hey, I agree with you. They all become like your little children, and I love all my characters. But I think probably Oswin, the monster from under the bed, he's just so much fun because he sort of goes against all the rules, and you can be as grumpy as you like and say the things that you wouldn't. And I know you shouldn't laugh at your own jokes, but I mean, I always do. And I'm writing him, and I'll, when you're going through a copy edit and you're like, oh, I forgot he said that. And I just love that he's such a coward, and when everyone's meant to be brave and stuff, and he's like, no, don't go there, don't do that, don't be stupid. So yeah, I love writing him, and I love writing Feathering the Dragon.
It's funny because obviously in Pages I have my own characters, but I also kind of borrow a lot of other people's characters, and honestly the most fun I have often is when I get to write with other people's characters, and like it can be a bit intimidating because like with Anne, she's so beloved, and you sort of want to make sure that you're doing these characters justice. But when I sort of feel like I've got a character's voice right, like I loved writing as Anne Shirley. This is, I don't know, I don't want to be spoilery, but there's a character in book 3 who is not my character. Well, it's not a fictional character, it's a real person from history that I have borrowed and given a new voice to, and I had the most fun. It took a little bit. The first draft, it wasn't right, and like one of the big notes I got from Nick, my editor, on the first draft was like, this voice isn't working, and I really sort of spent a lot of time trying to get it right. And when it like, when you just know that it's what, I was like, I've got it. I like clicked into it, and I enjoyed writing that character. What's been fun is that I'm writing book 4 at the moment, and my books are close third person, so it's third person, but you're seeing it through the perspective of one character, and you only get insight into one character's internal thoughts, and that's Tilly in the first 3, but in the next 3 it's a different character, but Tilly is present in the book, and I've actually really enjoyed getting to observe Tilly through somebody else's eyes, and it's kind of given me a new, I've spent so much time in her head, and it's given me a new kind of appreciation for her as a character, kind of getting to see how somebody else sees her.
So cool.
Diana asks, she said, how do you pick your illustrators? But it's not quite as simple as that. So first you should say, so Pages & Co, they're all illustrated by the brilliant Paola Escobar, who has done all 3 of the books, internal and the covers, and she is absolutely marvellous. And Starfeller's Sarah Warburton. And as Fan said, as someone you might have heard of, illustrator called Chris Riddell did Flock of Stars. So I don't know what it was like for you guys. I don't know. I think the situation with Chris might be different because it's Chris. But for me, I got like approval on the person that Harper sort of said, this is the person that we'd like to use, and sent me examples of Paola's artwork. And she's brilliant. And it wasn't controversial, but Harper very much picked who they would like. But I did get, like, I assume I could have said no, but I didn't want to.
Yeah, I had the same thing. I had the exact same thing. I wasn't really 100% aware of who Sarah was, but then I looked at her work and it was so stunning. And she'd done the first character proofs of Willow, and like an idiot, I started crying because it was just so gorgeous. And I was really worried because you just don't know, and the story's been with me for so long. So you can have an amazing author, illustrator, but they might not imagine it, how you would perceive it to be. But it was wonderful. And I think it was like a match made in heaven. So I don't know what it would have been to have Chris Riddell. I'm sure it's wonderful. I can't imagine you were disappointed.
It was similar in that HarperCollins, I think I'm trying to remember, there were whisperings of maybe we could ask Chris Riddell, maybe he would do it. And I was trying to contain my excitement because, like I said, I didn't really know the book world particularly, or certainly not as an industry before I got my book deal, but I did follow Chris Riddell on Instagram, and he was about the only person on Instagram that I followed. My little sister had set up my Instagram account because I'm such a granny, and followed him for me and was like, you would like Chris Riddell? And I was like, yeah, Chris Riddell's good. So then when HarperCollins said, oh, maybe Chris Riddell might be interested, I was like, and then he was, and I was like, so I didn't pick him, but I would have picked him.
Dia has asked, did you have so Dia is Jalen, but actually I've realized that's the same person, so I'll come back to this one. I want to just make sure that we can try and ask one question from everyone who's commenting before kind of going back. So Charlie and Jessie say, well, Charlie and Jessie ask what are our favorite books, and we kind of talked about what the books sort of that meant a lot when we were younger, but I wonder if anyone has any. What are your kind of favorite children's authors that are kind of writing at the moment, present company excluded, because it goes without saying that we're all huge fans of each other. I'm a big fan of Catherine Rundle. I think that she is honestly one of the best, not just children's, I think she's one of the best writers writing at the moment, and I think she's utterly brilliant. And I recently really enjoyed as well The Midnight Guardians by Ross Montgomery, which is just an absolutely magical, beautiful book.
Good choices. Yeah. I read a few months ago, Aisha Bushby's Moonchild, The Voyage of Lost and Found, and I loved that. That was brilliant. Again, it's a fantasy adventure about a girl who lives on a boat with her two sea witch mothers, and that just sounds so exciting and hooked me in from the beginning. I think this is probably for a slightly older audience, but I did really enjoy The Girl Who Became a Tree. I was looking behind me because I have got it there somewhere, but which is a story told in a set of poems. And I loved the fact that no matter how tired I was, I could dip into it. And even if I just read one poem that night and then I could fall asleep. And I was exhausted at the time of reading it, so that worked for me. But I think you can just dip in and read it in any order, but it also tells a really great story from start to finish of this girl who's in a library, and again she goes through a portal, she finds this sort of hole and crawls through it and finds this weird squirrel monster on the other side, and I thought that was horrifying and brilliant.
Love that. Yeah, gosh, I read so much, so sometimes hard to pick out favorites. I'd say look at my shelf to remind myself. But I loved is P.G. Bell, The Train to Impossible Places. And it's just the most joyous series, and his voice is just brilliant. And The Postmaster has just got such a special place in my heart. You know, when you finally get Susie, who's the main character, who gets whisked off onto this amazing adventure. you know, after so many years, he's finally got a staff, and he's just so delighted, and it's just so cute, and I love that style of writing. Trying to think. Oh, also love Cressida Cowell. I don't think. I mean, I'm sure her books have definitely gotten a lot of press, but I think her later series is just so good. And I love the idea of having two sort of main characters with each having their own story throughout. So, like the main character is Wish and the other one's Zar, and they're so different, and the one has magic, the one doesn't. I don't know if you've read it, but it's so funny. And Wish is from the warrior tribe. You know, she's not meant to have magic at all, but she ends up making magic out of iron, and she has a sort of personified like a spoon that follows her everywhere, and the spoon is just the most wondrous character in itself. So yeah, I love that kind of quirky humor and that kind of thing. Oh, and then just like on the sort of very literary side, I love Lauren Wolk. I think she wrote this book, was nominated for like every prize, Beyond the Bright Sea, and I thought that was so beautiful. And this main character named Crow, and just her world building, and it just felt so much like almost like a classic story from, you know, there's also baking and all these beautiful things and these characters that I love, and this amazing scenery and just the most beautiful writing. So yeah.
I just want to make sure I say hello to Brooke and Lydia, who are watching from New Jersey.
Wow.
Sorry, they've just said they're doing Pages and Co for their book club, and they're asking about tips. I'm going to put my author email address in the chat, and if you email me at that, we've got some like questions and activities and stuff, so I'll pop it in the chat, and if you email me I will send you those. And thank you for choosing Pages for your book club. I hope that you enjoy reading it together. I also I have to this is phrased as a question, and I just have to read it out because it's so joyous. Charlie has asked, can you write a story about 5 penguins and they are dancing, but the ice breaks and they are stuck on an island? I'm not sure any of us are taking specific requests, but what I want to say is that, Charlie, I think you should write that story, because that sounds brilliant. And I think that if you've come up with such a like creative idea, then it's you that needs to write that story.
Sounds amazing.
Oh, and this is just a quick, when should you start reading Northern Lights? I would say 12 at minimum. I would say when I first started reading it, I actually didn't, I came back to it when I first read it a little bit younger, and I didn't gel with it. So I would say 12, 13 is the perfect age to read that trilogy, or older. Okay, so Brooke, who is 10, would like to know how we come up with the names of our characters. So, Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, so names always mean so much to me. A lot of the names in Starphil have sort of plant inspiration. So Willow Masters, it was sort of a happy accident that it's actually a plant, because a lot of the magic in Starphil is around like the magic of plants and the natural world. And I just, it takes me a long time to figure out a name, but when it does, like for instance, and I always like it to have a story. So Essential Jones, her name, she was called Essential by mistake because she was the only girl, and when she was born with a fizz of magic, the rule is that she has to be taken away. If you're not, if your family hasn't got magic, she has to be raised by magical people. And the mother was quite horrified because after 5 boys it was her only girl, and she said, she's essential. And the witch who raised her took that a little bit too much to heart.
You can have a bit more fun, I think, with fantasy, because names can be a bit more on the nose. So I have a librarian who's called Amelia Whisper, and it's fun. It's part of the joy of writing fantasy. You can say a bit more with the characters' names. A lot of my characters are like I fun like Whisper is a librarian, and the characters that live on the train are called Milo and Horatio Bolt, and Bolt, funky. And then Tilly is Matilda because of Matilda. She can't book. Roald Dahl isn't out of copyright. can't use them for book wandering, so I wanted to kind of do an homage to kind of the kind of most famous bookworm in kind of children's fiction. So it's kind of a mixture, and I do always make sure I don't pick names based on what they mean, but I do always make sure that the name means something that isn't like kind of opposite. And I do like most of the characters' names mean something that tells you something about, like, their first names tell you something about their character, but I do always check to make sure they're not like the opposite. And some of them, if you googled them, you would get some clues about things. But that's not very good, like, kind of Easter egg, because some of them that doesn't work for all of them. It's just names I like. So
I think mine are similar. The two sisters who are from our world, Imogen and Marie, are essentially just girls' names that I like. But when we go into the magical world, quite a few of the names are Slavic influenced, and some of them are straight rip-offs of the Czech language, so I apologise to the entire Czech Republic for that. But it's similar in that I've often tried to look for names that give you a clue. In their original language, they will give you a clue about that character. But I also like it. I love it when I find especially a Czech word which means something I want it to mean for that character. So there's one a character in book 2 called Pateliesel, who is he's a bit of a weasel of a character. So I loved the fact that Pateliesel sounds a bit like weasel, but it also means the equivalent in English of lickspittle, so somebody who's like a brown noser. And I haven't succeeded in all of the names in doing that, but a lot of them, do give you a clue to what that person does, but also I like the sound of them.
We are basically out of time. I'm going to try and squeeze one more in with if we could all do short answers, because I know that we're running out of time. But I've just seen that Charlie has asked about our favourite animal, and I thought that would be a nice quick one to just finish off on. My favourite animal is, and it's also because I love I'm not a big animal person, but I love sea otters so much. And actually one of the things the Monterey Aquarium in California, which I've been to in real life, has like live webcams for a lot of their animals. And genuinely, if I feel stressed, I go and watch the sea otter webcam, because it just makes me feel calm and happy, and they're just so characterful and playful and cute. They're cute, the way they just hold each other's hands and float around in the water. They do that's not just like a meme, like they do on the webcam. So sea otters are my favorite animal.
Cool. I love animals, so I always really struggle with this. I do like cats, but I think my current favourite is horses, because as per previous discussion, horses are also a means of transportation. And I really like the idea that you can always escape on them. And I've read a few books recently, The Bear and the Nightingale, which is for grown-ups, I think, which involves a lot of escaping on horses. And I just like the idea that you can always take flight with a horse. Not that I know how to ride one. I always fall off horses.
Yeah, for me, it's my favorite domestic animal is definitely a dog. Such a dog person, and I just think they're the best companions ever. You can't really hear her now, but my bulldog is sleeping somewhere around the corner. And then my favorite wild animal is an elephant. I'm just obsessed with them. I just think they're so beautiful and they're so intelligent.
Great. I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you everybody who sent questions in, and I'm sorry that we haven't got to all of them, but I've tried to pick out as many as I can. But yeah, I'm sorry if we didn't get to them, but we are all on Twitter, and I can't speak for you guys, but I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm a Case for Books on Twitter, and I've also dropped my author email address. So if we didn't ask your question, please do. I'm more likely to get back to you quickly on Twitter than email, but I'm very happy to always chat and answer questions on Twitter. Do you guys want to, you're not obliged, I'm putting you on the spot, not obliged to say where you are on the internet, but if how should people get in touch with you if they want to?
Twitter is the same. You can get hold of me. I think it's Rose Valente, and that's probably the easiest. Otherwise, if you want to get through from my website, but yeah, probably easier on Twitter.
Yeah, I second that. I think I'm Fran_Gibbons on Twitter.
Fab. So do get in touch online elsewhere if you have burning questions that we haven't got to. All of our books are, of course, available everywhere that you buy books, or they do try and support your kind of local Waterstones and local independent bookstores as much as you are able to. Thank you so much to the Lit Festival for having us. Thank you to Mandy, who's, even though she wasn't able to be here, has done all the organising, and again, sending all our love to her. Thank you to Liam, who's been doing all the behind the scenes tech stuff. Thank you to our publisher HarperCollins, and particularly Des, who has helped organise this. Thank you to Francesca and Dominique, and thank you most of all to everyone who has tuned in and watched and asked questions. We really appreciate you spending an hour of your Sunday with us.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much.